Hey everyone, Once Bitten here with another Magic tutorial. This is the second Tactica in my series that's on Magic, and in this one we're moving on to in-game thinking about casting spells. And again, I'd like to give credit to Tactica, who contributed to a lot of the thinking behind this tutorial, or Tactica, I should say. So, as an overview, there's really only three sections I'm covering here. The first one I'm calling the Art of One, and I'll talk more about that in a second and what that means. Then I'll talk about prioritizing spells, and lastly, how to go about selecting how many dice you should use when casting spells. So starting with the Art of One. This is actually a term coined by Tactica. And another quote of his that sticks with me is, there is entirely too much thinking going on in most Magic phases. The Art of One basically is built on the premise that the design of the Magic phase in 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy is such that it doesn't need to be real complicated. Really, when you look at the Winds of Magic, where you roll 2 dice and you get the sum of those dice in power dice, and the higher number of the two goes to the number of dispel dice, the number of extra dice you get, for the most part, is only going to allow one more spell to get cast. So a useful way to think about it is your Magic phase is designed to get one spell cast. So just be smart about what spell you want cast and don't try to do too much. When you try to do anything other than that, and this doesn't apply to every situation, but in a lot of situations, when you try to go beyond that, you start taking unnecessary chances, and although sometimes you can get lucky and have a great Magic phase, a lot of times you find yourself really without a Magic phase. And I think that the most common mistake made is people simply don't use enough dice when they throw a spell. I guess I could put on there too, they choose the wrong spell. Now, there are, of course, some exceptions. Lizardmen, especially when they have the +1 to cast for every spell. High Elves, the Banner of Sorcery. Beastmen with their Herdstone and a bunch of Brace Shamans being spammed. And Dark Elves, the Power of Darkness and the Sacrificial Dagger. I mean, there are builds you can take that break this rule of the Art of One, where you should really have enough dice to have maybe a couple extra spells go off over and above what your opponent can dispel. So that's fine. I mean, you could actually take this everything we're talking about here and just expand it a little bit, call it the Art of Two or something. Some misconceptions I find, especially when people are approaching the Magic phase in terms of how many spells can I get off, or I want to get off every spell I have. And again, in case you haven't picked up on it, I'm saying that's the wrong way to think about it. But when you think that way, a lot of times people just assume that the more power dice you roll on the Winds of Magic, the better. And I think that is not necessarily true. I've seen several opponents roll 12 and get 12 power dice and have no spells go off because they tried too much. In their first spell, they don't throw enough dice, they don't get the spell, it ends for that caster, and it's done. Another thing to keep in mind too is, if you roll a lot of power dice, that means your opponent likely has 6 dispel dice. So while you are likely to get 1 or 2 more spells off than your opponent is, your opponent, if he or she knows what they're doing, will be able to stop the one spell that really matters for that particular situation. So a lot of times it's not necessarily good to have a lot of power dice in your pool. Some people seem to think that rolling low on the Winds of Magic is bad, and I say not necessarily. Sometimes if somebody rolls a 2 or 3 or 4, that's the best thing that can happen to their Magic phase, because they're almost guaranteed to get that one small to mid-sized spell cast, and very difficult for their opponent to dispel it. So that's really just kind of the underlying way of thinking about the Magic phase that I'm presenting here, is don't try to do everything. Don't try to get every spell cast. Be really particular and smart about which spell you want cast and how you're going to do it. Which leads us to, how do we prioritize the spells? Assuming we already chose the spells before the game started, we find ourselves rolling 2 dice for the Winds of Magic, and now it's our Magic phase. What do we do? Well, the first thing I would say is, know your damn lore. When you get to the game, and I've seen it happen a lot, where people will put 10 cards down and say, okay, what do these things do? And I'm like, this is not the time to learn the lore you're using. Now, if this is a friendly game and this opponent's the first time using that magic lore, I'm really cool with that. I'll grab my army book, sit down, and just take a break and start reading and let them figure out what these spells are. But in a tournament, it's just really, really bad form. And for the most part, if once you use the lore a few times, you really should know what your spells are and what they do, and you shouldn't be studying the cards at this point. Not only should you know what they do, but you should have thought about what are the uses for them. In what situations does a particular spell really work to your advantage? And the reason you want to know that is when you get into the game, at this point, you should have already assessed the situation going into your movement phase of kind of what's going on the board. And after you're done moving and you're going to your magic phase, you should already have a feel for what are the danger spots, what are the opportunities, what's going on in this battle. So as far as magic is concerned, what are your priorities? What are your priorities that your magic phase can help with? Do you need to do direct damage to a unit? I mean, does your opponent have maybe a Death Star or some kind of unmanageable unit? Maybe it's ethereal, maybe it's just fast moving, it's about to get behind your lines. Do you really need to assassinate a character? And I think a lot of times those aren't the most pressing needs. If there's a key combat going on, just a low-level buff or hex can make a huge difference in the outcome of that battle, and that might be the most important thing. It could be that you're just trying to influence your opponent's choices. For instance, if there's a unit you don't want him to charge, you can buff that unit, or you can hex his unit that you don't want him to charge with. If you have a large horde and your opponent has life and you think the Dwellers Below might be cast on them, and you can give them some kind of strength buff, you can influence your opponent's choices through your magic phase. And of course, then there's going to be other kinds of spells, such as movement spells and regrowth spells, such as what the vampires have. But it doesn't matter. I mean, all these kinds of things, you're looking around the board, what's the most important thing for this battle that's going on right now? And what spell do you have that can affect that? And I wouldn't make a formal process out of this, but I think in the back of your mind, you should look at the spells available to you, and they should be ranked. You should say, look, this spell changes the game. If I get this spell off, it makes a huge impact. It might even be a game winner. And that's a number one ranking. There are other spells that I think more commonly, because I don't think very often you have a game-changing situation, but you have another spell that's like, you know what, in this situation, it'd be really helpful if this spell would go off. I think that most spells available to you at any given time would fall under the 3, 4, or 5 category. They're okay. They help a little bit. But I ask myself, is it worth a miscast? And a lot of times the answer is not really. I mean, for the most part, I don't fear miscasts that much. But then again, a lot of times in a particular situation, any given spell doesn't help that much. So it doesn't mean I wouldn't throw any dice at it, but I'd be very clear in my mind about that spell is not a priority. So I think should happen very quickly, and I think this should happen in the back of your mind probably before you even roll the winds for the Winds of Magic. You should know what spells you have and in what rank are they going to affect this game right now. So my personal preference, and I don't think there's one set way of doing this, of course, but my personal preference is if there's a spell that I want and I think it's really important, it's a number 1 or a number 2, and I have enough power dice to cast it, and my opponent probably does not have enough dispel dice to stop it. That means we don't have a large Winds of Magic. I didn't roll a 12. Maybe I rolled a 6. And so I have 6 dice, and my opponent has 2. Or maybe I rolled a 5. I have 3 dice, he has 2. Whatever. I'm going to roll that number 1 spell because nothing else matters. If this is my best spell, and this is game-changing or really, really helpful, let's get that spell off. And unless there's a scroll in the background, it's going to go off. My opponent can't stop it. And I roll it first because you never know what could happen. If you roll another spell first, you might get irresistible force that could end your magic phase. You could fail to cast that one, and then you can't cast the spell that really matters. So if I think I have enough to cast it and my opponent can't stop it, then I cast the most important spell first almost every time. Now, if my opponent does have enough dice to stop it, now I may not throw it first. What I'm probably going to do is try to draw out some dispel dice first. So maybe I'll start with my number 2 spell, or if I rolled really high in the Winds of Magic, I might even start with my number 3 spell. And I'm going to throw enough dice to make sure those spells go off, because I don't need them ending my magic phase for my caster. Um, but I'm hoping that I can throw those, and my opponent might fall for it and dispel those, which leaves me free to get my most important spell off. And when people do that, I don't think they're necessarily making a mistake. I mean, sometimes it is better to dispel what's already been cast, because you never know what's going to happen in the future. But nevertheless, so if I have enough dice that I can cast 2 spells, and my opponent has enough dispel dice to stop either one, then I'll lead with my number 2 and hope that he uses his dispel dice to stop that one. And if not, you know what? If nothing else, I got my second spell off, which should be a pretty good one. Sometimes your number 1 spell isn't going to happen unless you use Irresistible Force. And I don't mean because it has such a high casting value. I mean everybody around that table, you, your opponent, the 4 people looking on, everybody knows the one spell that's really going to matter. So, you can throw all the dice you want at it. It's not going to happen. Your opponent's going to do everything he can to stop it unless you get Irresistible Force. So in that situation, it's not that I give up on it. I still am going to try it, but I'll probably try it last. And first thing I'm going to do is try to get my number 2 to go off, because my opponent probably can't stop that one. So let's get that one off. Let's make sure we at least get that much. And then I'll throw my 6 dice at the number 1, and we'll see what happens from there. Another thing just to throw in there too is if you know your opponent has a dispel scroll, then very early in the game it's very helpful to draw that out. And to do that, I mean, usually the situation you want is a spell that isn't, usually in the early game there's not a spell that's critical yet, but get one that your opponent would consider to be hurtful to him or her, and throw enough dice that probably he doesn't have enough dispel dice to stop it. And then he either has to let it go through or he has to burn that scroll. But I try to force difficult decisions on my opponents, and especially in the early game in the Magic phase, to get that dispel scroll out of the way, so that later on in the game when there's a key moment, I don't have to worry about it. So again, the basic philosophy is we're not trying to cast everything. We're trying to get 1, maybe 2 spells off at the max, and we're going to count on only getting 1 spell off. And so we prioritize them. So we know that we have 1 or 2 spells that we're going to try to cast, or possibly 3 spells that we're going to try to cast, really ultimately hoping that at least 1 goes through. How do we decide how many dice to throw at each one? Well, I said before that I think the number 1 mistake people make is they don't throw enough dice at it. My rule here is you never fail to cast a spell. It does 2 things. 1, it ends the phase for that caster. And if you've got a level 4 that's carrying the bulk of this load of your magic phase, and the phase ends for that caster, you've just screwed your whole magic phase. Another thing it does is, even if you fail with let's say you're level 2 and you still have your level 4, but you've just lost power dice and your opponent still has all dispel dice, you've just gone from having the advantage to probably being at a disadvantage. So, it doesn't ruin the entire phase, but it might. So there's I've heard several ways that people think through the numbers of how they do that, so I'm going to offer the way I use, and I'm not claiming that it's necessarily the best way or the only way, but I think it can be helpful. So, real basically, when I talk about casting value, that means how much is needed for the spell to go through. You subtract your magic level, because you get that automatically going towards every time you throw dice out there. So the difference there is the roll you need. So what I recommend doing is divide by 3 and then just round up as a starting point. And if you do that, and I'll go through the numbers in just a second, but if you do that, your odds of a successful cast are between 72 and 90%, which sounds like a big range, but the reason there's that range is it depends on how much you round up. If you divide the number, and let's say you come up with, I mean, you're not going to do the math exactly in your head right that moment, but let's say it's 4.1. I mean, when you do the division, when you round up to the next highest level, it's a big roundup. Going from 4.1 to 5 is a big roundup. Well, that means you're closer to the 90% success rate. But if you divide the roll you need by 3 and come up with 4.9, And so rounding up to 5 is a very small roundup. You're probably more at the 72% success rate. And even then, I would say, consider adding another one, especially if you didn't round up very much. If you divided and it came out to 4 point, and you don't know what is exactly, but you know it's really high, and so your roundup isn't much, consider throwing another die at it. So let me give some practical examples so that just makes more sense. So the casting value on a particular spell is 12. You're trying to cast it with a level 2 spellcaster. So you know you need to roll a 10. When you divide 10 by 3, you know it's going to be 3 and, well, I hope you know it's 3 1/3, but whatever. It's about 3.3. So when you round that up, your first thought is that's going to take 4 dice minimum. And the math on that is, because going from 0.3 to the next highest integer, 3.3 to 4, is a fairly high roundup, you have a 90% chance, if you use 4 dice, of getting that spell off. Which sounds great, and it is great. And if this isn't absolutely critical, a lot of times this is what I'll do. But you have to keep in mind that 10% of the time, you're going to fail to cast, and it might ruin your entire magic phase. That caster's out, you're at a disadvantage dice-wise, your opponent now has more dispel dice than you have power dice, and it's just screwed you. And that's going to happen every 10 times. That's going to happen. That's, every other game. So one thing to consider is if you can't take the chance of it happening, throw another dice. With 5 dice, you're at a 98.4% success rate. You're still, with my luck, I'm still going to fail that every now and then, but for the most part, you're going to get it through with 5 dice. And then, you might ask, but if I throw 5 dice, now the odds are better I'm going to get a miscast. Well, again, I'm not trying to cast 5 spells in this magic phase. I expect to get 1 or 2 spells off. If this spell is game-changing or really helpful, and I've already asked myself, is it worth a miscast? It's either worth a miscast or it's not worth a miscast. If it is, throw 5 dice at it. If it's not, well, I would consider throwing 4 dice at it, but I probably wouldn't do that before I did my main spell, because I don't want to miss it and then not be able to cast the spell that really matters. So I might just set 4 dice aside, and after the important spell goes through, whether it goes through or not, then I'll try this spell. So let's look at another example. Casting value on a spell is 10. You've got a level 4, so you only need a 6. Well, 6 divided by 3 is easy. That's 2, right? And I said round up. Well, 2 rounds up to 2. Because you didn't round up any, your odds of success are only 72%. That means that over a quarter of the time, almost 1/3 of the time, you're not going to cast it, and your level 4 is out for the rest of that phase. If you add 1 more die, you jump from 72% to 95% success rate. So divide by 3. Divide by 3, round up, and then add a die, and consistently you'll be at 90-something% success rate for it. So just to beat the horse dead and then continue kicking it. If the casting value is 15 and you're level 4, that means you need to roll an 11. You divide it by 3, and 3 goes into 9 and then goes into 12, so you know that it's 3 point something really high. So you're going to go 4 dice, but because you don't have to round up much, you know that you're not super high chance of getting it. That gives you, by the way, an 84% chance of casting. So again, 16% of the time, you're not going to get it through, and it's going to hurt your entire magic phase. So just add an extra die. 5 dice gives you a 97% chance success rate. And what you do with this is you force your opponent to make difficult decisions because your spells are going off. Put yourself in your opponent's position. What I'm hoping for is for the caster, when I'm dispelling, I want them to miss a spell. I'm dying for them to miss a spell. But if they always use enough dice that they're just going through, it forces me to choose. Do I stop this one and let a more powerful one come through later? Or do I let this one go through and then he might get his irresistible force later? It forces hard decisions, and that's what you want to do. And as long as you're focused on just getting 1 or 2 spells off, it's entirely possible. If you roll so low on the Winds of Magic that you're really only going to be able to cast 1 spell, that's great, because your opponent probably can't dispel it. So the problem is when you roll high enough on the Winds of Magic that you can cast multiple spells, that's actually where it gets trickier, because you have to decide how many dice you're going to allocate to each, knowing your opponent's going to have a lot of dispel dice and is probably going to be able to spell one of your spells. So again, in that case, I would cast, making sure I had enough dice to get it to go off, I would cast the least important one first in that case, burn the dispel dice, and then I'd throw my most important one, but only if I had enough dice to know that both of them could cast. So there you have it. That is Once Bitten and Loki the Trickster's philosophy on the magic phase. Keeping it simple, and keeping it simple in a way that makes a lot of sense based on the game design. You prioritize the magic phase based on one or two spells that are most important. You select enough dice to make sure it goes through, and force hard decisions on your opponent. And what that usually will do is give you a very consistent magic phase that complements the rest of your game, and it'll keep you from ruining a magic phase and altogether just because you failed to cast a spell, or you wasted time and power dice on unimportant spells, while your opponent very wisely saved a spell dice for the ones that really mattered. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed it.